Emeritus. As he descended into the darkness, Casey Lasko hoped it was just an electrical problem. He was in a stairwell of Ballantyne Hall, hurrying to his next appointment on the 6th floor. On the 9th floor, he had patiently waited 7 minutes for an elevator, but the buttons wouldn't light up when you pushed them, and not one of the 3 battered doors had shown even the slightest shudder of activity. And now the lights in the stairwell were flickering and buzzing and going out. At the first half landing there was still some light from above. At the next, Casey could barely read the sign, 8th floor, Department of Spanish and Portuguese. He pushed open the fire door and saw a crowd of 20 or more people, spectral outlines, the bulky shapes of parkas and backpacks, waiting in the dark for the elevators. He decided it was better to continue on foot. Back in the stairwell, he gripped the handrail firmly and counted the stairs as he walked down. 8 steps to the half landing. Almost pitch dark here. Another 8 to the 7th floor, where there was a sign for the Department of something or other, and a glimpse of light from below. He began moving more quickly, almost skipping down the stairs, until he reached the 6th floor, where the tubes in the light fixtures gave off their normal, flat, shadowless light. The buttons near the elevator doors were lit, but no one was waiting. Okay, thought Casey. Probably just deferred maintenance. Budget issues. Everyone here is used to it. 2 wrong turns later, Casey found the office of Professor C., Emeritus Chair of the Department of French and Italian. The door was open. Casey knocked lightly on the door frame. The professor, intent upon a large stack of brochures and envelopes, didn't seem to hear. Casey stood just outside the door and watched for a moment. How old was this guy? Maybe 75? No. Older. Much older. In one hand, the professor held a long letter opener adorned with what seemed like a papal seal. He opened a thick letter, scanned its pages, then tore the envelope in 2 and each page into neat quarters. Then he gathered the scraps into his hands and, turning toward the wastebasket, froze at the sight of Casey in the doorway. "Excuse me, Professor," said his visitor. "I'm Casey Lasko." The professor looked puzzled. His cupped hands, filled with torn paper, trembled above the wastebasket. "I called you last night," said Casey. "We had an appointment." "Oh, yes, yes," said the professor, dropping the papers into the waste. "Victor's friend, of course." He moved a satchel to the floor and pointed to the empty chair. "Si accomodi. Please sit down. I must apologize for not inviting you to my home last night when you called. But my wife, she isn't well enough to entertain these days. She would have insisted on cooking. It would have been too much for her. A questo invito vengo molto rari. Few they are indeed these days. Better to meet you here, despite the formality." He indicated, with an expansive gesture, the piles of books and papers stacked around the office. "Un tumulto il qual s'aggira. Do you know Dante?" "Well," said Casey, "I've read the Inferno in English." "You must keep going," said the professor. He leaned toward Casey as if in a tutoring session. "What I said means a tumult that goes whirling on. Do you see? That's my office. Everyone says it's un tumulto, But I know exactly where everything is." The professor grinned proudly. Casey returned the grin, and by doing so, lied. He hadn't minded being an assistant the last few months, being the organized one, but he could never work for and would never hire someone like this, someone who prided himself on disorder, who claimed to possess the secret archaeological key that could unlock the mess. "As you can see," said the professor, "I have a lot of catching up to do. L'alto lavoro è tutto in lui medieve." The professor didn't translate, and Casey had no clue what the phrase meant, but he heard a note of despair in the old man's voice. Casey handed him his card. Yes, Casey Lasko, of course. We met at the reception, didn't we, afterwards? Tanto quando la tomba si distende. The reception, said Casey. But the professor, studying the business card, ignored the question. "I had no idea you worked in television. Lasko. That's a Kashubian name, isn't it? And Casey, that must be short for Casimir." He set down the business card and fixed his eyes on Casey. "Ci muovi popusco," said the professor. "Oh, my God," thought Casey. "What is this, a snap quiz?" "No," he said, "I don't speak Polish." "But you understood," said the professor, his eyes sparkling. "Mowi po polsku trochę, tylko kilka słów." Please, thought Casey. This old man knows 2 lines of Polish, and he wants me to love him for it. Well, I'll play along. "I'm afraid I know even less," said Casey. "My grandmother tried to teach me, my father's mother, but I didn't see her often, and she died when I was 4. "Che peccato," said the professor. "What a shame." He opened a drawer and put Casey's card carefully on what seemed like a stack of old receipts. "And what did you want to speak to me about?" Casey hesitated, uncertain as to how much the professor remembered about their phone conversation the evening before. "Well, I was hoping you could tell me about Victor Damiani." "Vittorio," said the professor. "Yes, that's why we're here. What a wonderful young man." He reached over to a nearby pile of papers and pulled one deftly out. "Vittorio wrote the best essay by a sophomore in all my years of teaching. You're not surprised to hear that, are you? It's the first real composition class after they've declared their major, and I always ask them to tell me why. Why Italian? Why are you majoring in this language? I ask them to dig deep. They rarely do, but Vittorio." The professor paged through the essay, nodding sadly. Casey reminded himself what he was doing here. He hadn't come to Bloomington to chat with eccentric professors. He hadn't flown to Indiana to research local color. He didn't care whether the author was named Victor Damiani or Vittorio Damiano or Damien di Savoia Underwood. Casey Lasko was here to get the rights. The rights to tell the story, not for storytelling night at your local coffee shop, but on TV, to make money telling the story, serious money, to put a big fat target on your back and say to the world, yeah, we've got deep pockets from the story. Go ahead and try to sue us, and you won't get anywhere, because Casey Lasko sewed up the rights on this trip to Indiana University in February 2003. It was time to get down to business. "I'm sorry, Professor," said Casey, "but I was looking for contact information. I need to get in touch with Victor Damiani." "But I thought you were his friend," said the professor. "His childhood friend from Skokie." "No," said Casey. The professor's face showed confusion and a touch of fear. Better take a moment to reassure him. "I can see how you might think so. I'm probably about the same age as Victor, and I am from the Chicago area, but I grew up in a different suburb. I've never met Victor. Do you have his address? His phone number?" "But you were there, weren't you?" said the professor, "when I read this essay at his funeral." His funeral. Casey was surprised, but somehow not that surprised. "You mean he's dead? Victor Damiani? He died?" "It was last month. I met you. You were there. Così la mia memoria si ricorda." "Sorry," said Casey. "It wasn't me." The professor looked down at the essay, holding it tenderly as if it were a child, a wise child who could explain everything. Casey glanced around the office at the stacks of books and papers. He wondered how many other pieces by Victor Damiani were hidden in those piles. Years later, Casey would tell this story to his own assistant. "That moment," Casey would say, "that was the beginning of my career. I looked at that confused old man, and I tried to smile. I tried to be reassuring, but my mind was racing. At that moment, I had no idea who owned the rights, whether Victor had made any arrangements. I had no idea who I'd be dealing with, or exactly what I'd be buying. But I had already decided that I had to get the rights to everything Victor Damiani had ever written. I looked at that old professor, and somehow I glimpsed what Damien de Savoia Underwood would become. So much more than the alias of some screwed-up fat kid from Skokie. So very much more. That was the moment when I began to build the brand.